Good morning and welcome to UK Column viewers and listeners wherever you are in the world. And I do hope today that we're going to have people joining us. Well, for this video, we're going to have people joining us from not only UK and the United States, but right the way across the world, because I think the topic today is extremely important. The subject is essentially 9/11 and events around 9/11. My guest today is Karl W.B. Schwarz, who's the Managing Director and CEO of Katata Nanotech Group based in Europe. And this gentleman has a very impressive track record around events connected to 9/11. And I'll just put my glasses on to summarize these a little bit. So he's author of the 2004 book, One Way Ticket to Crawford, Texas. And the byline for this book is A Conservative Republican Speaks Out. Karl has also been featured guest on approximately 200 radio shows for 1 to 2 hour segments discussing September the 11th, 2001, and other geopolitical events that preceded and followed that day. And I think there's a very interesting word in that sentence, which is preceded, events leading up to. And these are clearly events that many people are simply not aware of what was taking place in the world. And Karl has gone into these in great detail. He's also been a key presenter at the September the 11th, 2004 Jimmy Walter sponsored event in New York City on 9/11, and that was entitled Confronting the Evidence. And an important point is that Karl's office was in DC from 1990 to June 1996, and some of what he knows predates the September 11th, 2001 by years. So essentially, Karl has spent a huge amount of time putting information. Now, before I bring him on live, I'm just going to bring up a picture so that our viewers can see Karl W.B. Schwarz. And Karl, welcome to UK Column.
Oh, thank you for having me on today, Brian.
It's a pleasure. Now, I think we should be honest with our audience and say that this is actually take two, because some time ago we sat down to do this interview. It was a good interview. There was a lot of information, but when we got to the end, I'm going to say both of us felt that maybe there was more that we could do. So I'm being very honest with the audience. And so we decided we'd rework some of the material. We'd have a second take at it. And today's interview is that second take. And I think our audience are going to be utterly fascinated at the information that comes forward. And I'm going to add to that this information is really only a fraction of the material that Karl and a team around him have assembled over the last few years, which that material raises a lot of questions about events at 9/11. Now, if people have forgotten, let's just put an image up on the screen, because, of course, this is one that many people saw over and over and over again, and it's of planes hitting the World Trade Center buildings in New York. I clearly remember the day. I was at work in Plymouth, and suddenly the news reports started to come across the radio. We subsequently switched on a television. And I remember sitting there utterly horrified with my work colleagues as we watched that fateful day unfold. Now, I thought for our audience today that there was probably no better way of recapping what the official version was, at least, by looking at what the BBC had to say. And I've chosen for this a little news clip from the BBC's children's programme called News Round, and I think this is a very appropriate place to start. I've cut out some material just to keep it short, but nevertheless, I think in this clip we will get a flavour of not only what happened in 9/11, on the 9/11 events. But of course, we'll also get a strong sense of how the BBC saw events and how they would like people worldwide to understand those events. So let's have a look at BBC Newsround coverage of 9/11.
September 11th, 9/11, the Twin Towers. These are phrases you've probably heard. You might know a little bit about what they mean. You might know loads, or you might not really know much at all. But the story is an important one because it's about an attack on America that changed the world 20 years ago. Not only has it shaped history, but 9/11 has had a huge impact on events in the news then and also now. First, we're going to hear from people who were your sort of age when it happened. They've told us what it was like being a young American when their country went through such a dramatic event. Carrie, Walter and Rachel were all children at the time of the attacks, living in different parts of the United States. We spoke to them about what they remember from the day. 20 years ago, the world was enjoying the beginning of a new millennium. At the centre of the world was the United States. It was at the heart of international politics and it had military bases across the world. The country was also welcoming a new president into the White House.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
George Bush became president at the start of 2001 and spent his first months in office meeting other countries' leaders. To them, he was now in charge of the world's most influential nation. At the centre of New York were the enormous Twin Towers. The buildings were 110 stories high and thousands of people worked in the offices. Al-Qaeda is an Islamist extremist group who blamed America for many of the world's problems. They had twisted beliefs which they used to justify violent attacks. In 1998, the group began to plan an attack known as the Planes Attack. By the year 2000, terrorists had made their way into the United States. US officials knew the group were targeting their country, but didn't know where. They were taken by surprise when the well-organised attack finally happened. On Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda's terrible plan was carried out. 4 teams of terrorists took control of 4 flights shortly after they'd taken off. The terrorists had been trained to fly planes. 2 were crashed into the enormous Twin Towers in New York and 1 into the Pentagon, which is the home of America's military in Washington, D.C. The 4th flight crashed after its passengers fought back and took action to prevent the plane reaching its target. In New York, the 2 towers collapsed following the attack. Debris was found almost 3 miles away. 3,000 people died in the attacks, including several hundred emergency workers who raced to help. US President George Bush addressed the nation on the evening of the attacks. Part of his address said,
Today our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America.
The attacks led to President Bush declaring a war on terror.
So, Karl, according to the BBC, it was also very simple. And I deliberately chose a children's clip because, of course, this demonstrates how the BBC wants to reframe the way particularly young people think about the world. That little cartoon documentary, of course, is designed to absolutely fix the official line into the minds of children. Similar material, of course, has been pushed out for adults. Now, before I bring you back to give your comments, I wanted to pop up on screen something that you said in one of the documents to me, and I'd like to set it against the backdrop here of the BBC's report. And of course, in that central photograph, we've got the true horror of what actually took place as those buildings, first of all, were on fire and then later collapsed. But these were your words. You said it was a Pearl Harbor to justify a shift in Bush-Cheney oil strategy and war policy, a day that will live in infamy and history as the ultimate definition of US oil greed. Now, that might seem an astonishing statement to many people, but of course they don't have the advantage of your deep research. So over to you. What's your response to the BBC's version of events?
The official story, like you said earlier, my office was in D.C. 1996. And it was during that period of time that Time magazine came out with an article that everybody in Washington, D.C., the liberals and the conservatives, thought George Herbert Walker Bush Sr., had totally lost his mind. The title was USSR Operation Steppe Shield. This was before they did Desert Shield, Desert Storm. They were actually trying to come up with a plan to invade the U.S. large blocks of areas that are now called Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, which are loaded with oil and natural gas. And they're loaded to the point to where we did the math of what they were talking about coming from Turkmenistan across Afghanistan, Pakistan. They could have loaded 8 to 9 super tankers a day, each holding 2 million barrels. That's how much oil and gas is up there, and they could do it for over 30 years. So the Bush family has been after this for a long time. And then when I found out what was going on in the Caspian, I told you in the first interview, and say it here, Bridas Corporation already had signed contracts with Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan to build that pipeline. And they ran into nothing but problems from about 1995, 96, all the way through to just being pushed aside because of 9/11.
Karl, thank you very much for that. And we are going to get into the depths of what was happening in those geopolitical events. But let's share with our audience a little bit of a coincidence, which was that you'd actually watched a UK column interview. It was an interview that I did with the CIA's head of litigation, Joseph B. Sweeney. And in that interview, you picked up on the fact that he mentioned Clinton's national security advisor at the time, Sandy Berger. And as a result of that name, you subsequently got in contact with me because you were so fascinated that Joseph B. Sweeney had mentioned Sandy Berger. Why was that coincidence so important to you?
Because of what was happening during the George Herbert Walker Bush administration and Clinton, and then we all know what happened in the George W. Bush administration. Sandy Berger was possibly stealing and destroying documents that deal with multiple issues. First, on February 26, 1993, the World Trade Center North Tower had a huge bomb go off down in the below ground areas, the parking areas. And after I found out about the Asbestos lawsuit, it started in 87, and then it got fired up again in 91 as a different type of lawsuit, and then again in 1995. They may have been trying to recover records and destroy them because Clinton fired the FBI director because he was doing an internal investigation of who in the hell in the FBI aided and abetted that bombing. And he called up William Sessions, who was FBI director, former U.S. District Court judge, and just summarily fired him. Said, "Get off the property right now." And that all started adding up. It took years later, just who you are, where you're doing business, who you meet, that all the pieces started coming together about 1999. That something big was going to happen to those towers. And it was just a matter of when and how. So I already knew what to look for as early as 93 and 94, all the way up to 99. That's when I met Bridas Corporation.
Now, just to set the scene, you have been working with a group of people for a long time, putting together a court submission about the whole events that took place around 9/11. And the principal target, and you correct me if I'm not spot on, if I'm not right with this, but the principal target is the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. This organisation is vast. It looks after air, land, rail and sea transport in the New York, New Jersey area. It's a multi-billion US dollar company, I believe. And it also had responsibility for the World Trade Center at the time. So just tell us a little bit about the Port Authority itself and why your team has made them such a fundamental part of the court application.
Well, they filed the first lawsuit in 1987 against the asbestos supplier. When I was in architecture school, we had to study the World Trade Center structural design. A lot of people do not realize that those four walls that went up 110 stories tall are not structural load bearing. They just carry a part of the floor load for each floor. The total load capacity, carrying capacity of the World Trade Center was actually carried by the central core. And they used something they called a cupola that actually was suspending those four walls on all four sides, and then transferring that weight back into the core of the building, which was massive. You couldn't bring down the core of the building with a jet or even normal explosives they use in controlled demolition. It was done an entirely different way.
Right, and the New York Authority had total control and responsibility for the World Trade Center buildings. Karl, is that correct?
That's correct. They commissioned them. They were designed and built, and they've been operating them. There was probably close to 10 million square feet just in the two towers. Each one of those floors is right at 1 acre of floor space. So there was a lot of. You add in the other buildings, I think it's something on the order of 16 million square feet. World Trade Center 1 through 7.
And the Port Authority had total responsibility for those buildings, not only in the operation, but also in security. And I'm going to say, for a particular reason, health and safety issues around those buildings.
Exactly. They did contract out some things like the security access systems and basic security. You have to have a card to get into the building or the parking deck. And they handled all of that through another company. And that started off as supposedly Burns and Rowe Securicom until a Securicom company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, sued them for copyright trademark violations. They fought it out in court for like 4 years. The defendants appealed it twice to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in Philadelphia. They lost. They lost the main lawsuit in New Jersey. They lost both appeals, and then they had to change their name, and it pops up as Dissect, and that's a Delaware corporation. But what was odd to me, Dissect predated even their use of the name Securicom by years.
We're getting into some of the chronological history here, Karl, and we're going to look at that in more detail in just a few minutes. But already the thing which is so fascinating for me is that before discussing events of 9/11 on the day, you are talking about events that were taking place previous over quite a long period of time. And when I started to read through some of the considerable information that you sent through to me prior to this interview, a phrase came into my head, mens rea, which in the criminal sense is the guilty mind that if an event is going to take place, perhaps a crime of theft or even a murder is going to happen, one of the things that you are looking for is, was there an intent to do this? Was there a guilty mind? And I think that when we look at 9/11, and certainly when we look at 9/11 events armed with the considerable research and information that you and your team have done, we start to have some very interesting questions around, was it as simple as the BBC would have us believe on the day, that it was simply Al-Qaeda terrorists, or were there far deeper things going on around the World Trade Center buildings? Before I let you respond to that, Karl, this was something you sent through to me, and I think it's very concise. So let's just read it out. Essentially, the allegation is that the Port of New York and New Jersey Authority and the Bush administration lied to America and the world about the September 11 events in 2001, why it happened, and what the real motive and objective was in blaming it all on Afghanistan. So the BBC really picked up on that, because it said, oh, well, basically these nasty terrorists came along and they attacked the World Trade Center with aircraft, buildings collapse, thousands of people die. It was those terrorists. But here you're raising some different issues, that it wasn't as simple as Afghanistan being in the background. And in the bottom part of the screen, you said that the US had been conspiring since 1990 to go after the Caspian Basin region and Afghanistan, because it held a key position in that region to get oil and national gas to an ocean port. Now, you've touched on this a few minutes ago, but just tell us a bit more about your position and the position of the team in stating that when you look at the evidence around 9/11, it was not as simple as just terrorists appearing on the screen and attacking US.
You've seen that video I sent. It's a very quick video, but it's taken by a Canadian banker. And when we got our hands on that in late 2003, it didn't take much to prove that that is not a 767. That was a 737 jet. So that blows a big hole in the official story, because what was supposedly hijacked was two Boeing 767, which seated about 350 to 400 people, and the other jet was much smaller. So over the years, and sometimes just weeks and months, a little bit of pieces just kept popping up. And what we kept looking for were what I call vectors and the chronology issue. And when you know of 5 or 6 different vectors and chronology issues, and they all point back to the destruction of 9/11, and they're coming out of multiple U.S. states. They are not coming out of Afghanistan. They're not coming out of Saudi Arabia. Somebody that can think it through and connect the dots, it's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, they have tried to paint it as a conspiracy theory, that anybody that challenges their official narrative. But if you've seen in the documents I've sent you, we've got the facts. We've got them all nailed down to where this is who did it, and this is why they did it. And it was a small group of people.
And that's the key statement. It's not only what they did, but it's how they did it. And this is where that concept of the guilty mind comes in. This wasn't just circumstantial, or this wasn't just events around a terrorist threat, because there's too much evidence that can be brought forward. Now, I've got some statistics here which you were very keen to bring in front of people again. This is the sad truth of what took place. So 2,753 died at the World Trade Center, 184 at the Pentagon on the 11th of September 2001. But you make the key point that even more have died since in the general area of the World Trade Center as first responders, as post 9/11 cleanup crews, residential and business tenants, as a result of asbestos induced cancer. Now, this is not something that the average person has heard about in looking at reports across worldwide media. So just take us in a little bit, because I've got more information to bring up on screen to do with asbestos. But tell us why you've got this comment about people suffering as a result of asbestos-induced cancer.
Well, after 9/11, there were a lot of people complaining about sudden onset of major health problems. Christine Todd Whitman, former governor of New Jersey, she was appointed by Bush to head the EPA. Environmental Protection Agency. She kept assuring everybody that everything was fine. And, when we already know what they're after in Afghanistan, and people were getting very sick, especially the cleanup crews and the people that were first responders, it wasn't adding up. But it did take us about 2 years before we actually found that asbestos lawsuit. They have tried to keep that absolutely hush hush. I even tried to get a copy of the final order that doomed the World Trade Center. It's dated May 17, 2001. They were seeking close to $6 billion for the 3 airports and the World Trade Center asbestos remediation, mitigation, get rid of it. And they wouldn't even let me have a copy of the order. I said, "Is the case file sealed?" They said, "No, we're just not allowed to distribute any documents regarding this case." They didn't want anybody knowing about the asbestos lawsuit. And they also didn't want anybody knowing about Bradas Corporation's lawsuit down in Texas. They filed a huge, $15 billion lawsuit against the people who were interfering with them in the Caspian Basin, specifically in Turkmenistan.
Karl, this is a very, very interesting point because, of course, asbestos is a well-known problem within buildings and indeed ships and other locations around the world. The problems of cancer induced by asbestos, very well known. And over a number of years, particularly in the late 80s through the 90s and onwards, we've had constant warnings, certainly within professional trades around construction and buildings, to carry out risk assessments to identify asbestos within any building and the risks that it presents to both workers and visitors to the building. So this is not an isolated thing. What you're describing has to be viewed against the backdrop that within the US as a whole, the government was encouraging, under health and safety, reviews of asbestos in buildings with the goal of either removing it if it was safe to do it, or else sealing it so that asbestos couldn't be a problem. But here you are telling us that actually asbestos was a big problem in the World Trade buildings. Do you know where it was situated in the buildings? Was it throughout, or was it a localized problem?
It was mainly the fireproofing for the structural steel. And the outside perimeter was actually horizontal plates and vertical tubes that were steel, but they were much wider gauge. The only thing they did was carry 1/2 of the load of, say, a floor joist. But once that load came down on the outside wall, it was actually being carried by the top and transferred back to that center core. The center core of the building was massive, incredibly strong. You couldn't have brought it down with a jet.
Structural steel was coated with some form of asbestos compound in order to effectively fireproof the steel to give it a longer life in a hot fire environment.
Exactly. The only 10 floors, one of the parts of the lawsuit I'm describing over in Newark, New Jersey, they had renovated 10 floors so they could rent them out. And that was where the first plane hit the North Tower. Those 10 floors were taken out with the first plane. And that was Cantor Fitzgerald, Marsh McLean, and also the Japanese Nippon Bank, Nishi Nippon Bank of Japan. They all had offices on those 10 floors.
So the asbestos had been known about well before. You've mentioned the lawsuits, and again, we'll come back to that. We've got a little bit more detail in the timeline about that. But of course, once the plane struck, and certainly when the buildings collapsed, the dust was highly contaminated. And what you're saying here is that this was clearly known both to the World Trade Center authorities and indeed it must have been to the state of New York, because any risk assessments would have come under the remit of New York itself.
Exactly. The Port Authority, the state of New York, and even the federal government knew about this. And they have kept it absolutely quiet. They wanted everybody to think, oh, gosh, we got attacked by terrorists, so let's blame it on Afghanistan and go steal that pipeline right away. I mean, that's basically how simple it is once you know the facts.
That dust arrived in the streets, and we saw, of course, many photographs and video clips of massive dust clouds. But what you're identifying here as just one point is that actually it had been known for a long time about the asbestos risk, and therefore asbestos was in that dust cloud.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
The fact that the Port Authority, the state of New York, probably the city of New York itself as a separate government, and the federal government, they all knew about the problem. And what I've said on radio before, somebody figured out a convenient way after they lost the asbestos lawsuit. They were not going to get $6 billion to fix the problem. You know, the Urban Renewal Project comes in called September 11, 2001. Right. And they spread that stuff everywhere. The EPA was quietly cleaning up the residences in the area, after people were screaming at them for so long. And that video that I sent you of me at Jimmy Walter's event, the woman sitting on my right, she was former EPA, and she had been all over EPA about the asbestos issues and the other things in the air that were deadly. They're harmful.
And so the comments that we heard earlier in the BBC clip of Bush saying that we met terror with the wonderful response of those first aid and responding teams. This is very, very cynical, because, of course, those people were put fully in harm's way in their courage to come and help people who'd died or been injured as a result of the attack on World Trade Center. Very cynical when you put these pieces back and look at what actually took place in the immediate aftermath and the cleanup.
It wasn't until 2015, Sputnik News out of Russia ran an article, and it said, "Why do 4,000 first responders have cancer?" Not a single television station that I heard or a newspaper touched on that headline. And that's a big headline. And actually, the number was a little over 3,700. Yeah. They already had cancer. And these were the first responders.
Yeah, it's tragic. Karl, you sent me a little clip of an independent report going way back to the 9th of November, 1993. It says, tapes reveal the role of the FBI in bombing. Leaked phone taps are embarrassing investigators during the World Trade Center trial. Now, remember, this is 1993. And if I put a bit of text in here, this was your comment on this particular article. Most Americans forgot or never knew that the World Trade Center 1 North Tower was bombed on February the 26th, 1993. They forgot or never knew that, and they forgot or never knew that FBI Director William Sessions was summarily fired by President Bill Clinton because he launched an internal investigation as to who in the FBI aided and abetted that crime. I'll just put up, this is a still from a video which I found, which was the swearing in of William Sessions. So you can see him there on the left with Ronald Reagan. And that was the 2nd of November, 1987. So that independent report was actually very telling, because in it was talking about FBI agents actually working with the team who were planning to build World Trade Center.
They actually helped them procure the explosives to do the bomb and all the stuff that they put in that truck. They pulled into the building with a big truck. and detonated it. And quite a few were killed, a lot were injured. But what I think, just the timing, the chronology issue, the lawsuits were already known. They knew about the asbestos problem. They were losing the lawsuits. They had already lost the first one in '87. It had been transferred over to U.S. District Court in Newark, New Jersey. And literally, this one judge in New Jersey had already issued a partial summary judgment in favor of the defendants. So the Port Authority knew they were on the ropes of ever winning, that $6 billion. But this goes back to Sandy Berger, too. There was not only the 9/11 issue, not only the bombing issue, the FBI complicity issue, Clinton's firing the FBI director because he had that internal investigation. But they were also in the process of getting ready to attack Serbia in 1999. And when you started seeing those same names, the same guy that was arming Muslims over in Serbia to kill Christians to justify intervention, and his name also pops up over here in the Caspian Basin, and he was not named directly, but he was lobbying for who got sued by Berdas Corporation in Texas. All those names are right there, and it all ties together.
This is another example of geopolitical events which are there, I'm going to say, swirling around the World Trade Center. And the issue comes up, can we trust what the authorities have to say, indeed what the security services have to say? Because when that gentleman tried to do the right thing as FBI director, he was removed in quite a robust way. And this brings me back to my interview with Joseph B. Sweeney, because, of course, what he was telling me as a man who'd been the former head of CIA litigation was that there were events taking place around the Biden administration, in particular the way Trump was being treated. But essentially, he's describing the security authorities, the intelligence services, as being out of control. And that viewpoint was reinforced by another CIA man I interviewed, which is J. Michael Waller, who's written a book about the fact that the people who should be protecting the US, the intelligence services, but the FBI also get a mention, that they're not to be trusted. And yet these are the people who were then on the world stage telling people what had actually happened around the World Trade Center bombing, 9/11 bombings. So this is a very dark and murky pond that you've started to go fishing in.
Well, I've said it this way, Brian, for years. If you want to go down the rabbit hole, just be forewarned. There's no rabbits down there. The only thing you're going to find are skunks and demons and monsters. I mean, this is one of the most horrible things I've ever seen happen in my life. And I really resent it. I'm a man who's very principled about the truth. I really resent it that all of America and part of the world has been systematically lied to for so long. And that one day, that one event triggered so many changes. Like George Bush created Project BioShield. Trust me, we know this too. We're on another case. Project BioShield was COVID down your throat. Forced vaccination. Bush had planned on forced vaccinating all of America. He's going to start off with the first 10 million who happen to be first responders. Then he creates BARDA, and inside of BARDA is a brand new position called ASPR, which is a military person that has authority under national emergency authorization, stuff like that, to take over total control of health response. Every nation in the world saw that happen during COVID too. So it all started in his administration, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse through Obama. Obama weaponized the DOJ, weaponized the FBI, and then Trump tried to turn it back some, and then Biden just went absolutely crazy weaponizing. And you're right; they're not protecting anything except the deep state.
Your book Karl, let's just jump back a little bit to your one-way ticket to Crawford, Texas. A lot of detail in that book. And let's just give the audience a little bit of a flavour. I'll read out a couple of the chapters. Chapter 1, you say, seeing the light of reality on Bush-Cheney has been a painful process for me. Chapter 2, our military serves under a dishonourable commander-in-chief. The Bush neocons may be intentionally undermining our military strength and the national security of this nation with their greed. Oxymoron equals Bush national security. Planting weeds in America's road garden. The Bush-Cheney energy policy, myopic, brain-damaged and treasonous. Global double-crossing and other Bush lies, impunity in building a peaceful tomorrow. Those are some pretty hard-hitting titles for your chapters. What made you write that book, and what was your objective in actually writing One Way Ticket to Crawford, Texas?
Well, I mentioned this at Jimmy Walters' event, third anniversary of 9/11. We were already working diligently on some things that were actually focused more on capital markets fraud. And that fraud was running rampant during the Bush administration. So every time he would open his mouth about the rule of law, blah, 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 I literally wanted to throw a shoe or a boot through my television screen. I knew he was lying. We had enough information to prove it. But every step of the way, we have had huge pushback to this, just to keep us from ever coming after them.
Did writing the book, did that cost you personally? I don't mean in a financial sense. I meant, was there a pushback at you starting to push out the information you did at the time?
When I made the decision to move to Europe, it wasn't because of the book or any fear of George Bush. Our scientists figured out some huge breakthroughs in nanotechnology. And I had 5 nations in Europe, 50 hertz grid. That's very important for what we do, 50 hertz electric grid. They were competing to get my company in the R&D center. So I had 5 nations I was cooperating with to form the initial financial structure. And the Bush administration made sure every bit of it just went up in smoke. Literally came over here, fried people, bullied people, and CIA running around slandering and defaming the hell out of me, just because I wrote the book about George Bush, about what a liar he is. The truth is going to come out about 9/11, whether they like it or not.
You've gone from your book, speaking out to a lot of people, with a lot of research to hand about what took place at 9/11 and what took place beforehand and afterwards. But this has now got to the point where with a team, you've been able to assemble documents to go forward to court, and that's to the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. Just one opening document there. But the key point is here that you're doing this on behalf of a number of plaintiffs. And if I just bring these up on screen, I'll let you obviously talk us through this. But essentially, you say that the main group is Group A, which is bringing a civil and criminal lawsuit on behalf of a number of other groups. And they are Group B, the survivors of all 2,753 people killed at the World Trade Center, plus the 184 killed in the Pentagon. Plaintiffs Group C, all living and or survivors of first responders and those involved in the post-9/11 cleanup, who are battling asbestos-induced cancer, or perhaps they've already died from it. And it also, that group of people who suffered during the cleanup includes World Trade Center tenants that were exposed and or have survivors. You've got a plaintiff Group D, which is the WTC area residents and businesses willfully and negligently exposed to asbestos. And plaintiff Group E, all military personnel sent to be maimed or die for a lie, and those permanently harmed by anthrax vaccines, whether living, maimed due to combat injuries, or now deceased. This is a very, I'm going to say, altruistic court case, because you haven't taken the people who've immediately suffered. You've also, in my opinion, quite rightly expanded it to all the people who subsequently were harmed or died as a result of the enforced political events that took place following the attacks on World Trade Center.
It was also more than that, Brian. It was the continued willful negligence and lying and the cover-up. I mean, even the 9/11 Commission, 6 of the 10 people said that the whole 9/11 Commission was set up to fail. The guy who was micromanaging everybody, Philip Zelikow, he was the author of Bush's preemptive war doctrine. This guy's not a military guy. He's not a politician. He's a book. He was a book author. He teaches. I think he's now at the University of Virginia. But the systematic lying and cover-up all the way through is what really started getting on my nerve. You remember in chapter 1 of my book, Mara Leverett, she's from my home city. She wrote something, and she allowed me to cite her in my book about how malignant lies are. They're just as dangerous as guns when it comes to your personal freedom and liberty. And when you look at how much has changed about freedom and liberty, just because of 9/11, and that 9/11 was based on a lie, the attack on Afghanistan is based on a lie. It's like, do the math right. I mean, the dots connect, and the guilty need to be brought to justice.
Karl, you pointed this out very clearly. I'll bring this up on screen because there was another group of plaintiffs, Group F. And here you're talking about exactly that. Nations and people wrongfully attacked based on the political lies of Washington, D.C. So you have Iraq, 1990 and 1991, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. You have the events in Serbia that took place. You have Afghanistan in 2001, Libya 2001 and 2003, Iraq 2003, and there at the bottom, Syria in 2012 and onwards. And if we just take Syria alone to look at the slaughter and the horrors that have taken place in that country. And your key point here is that if people can't trust what their own governments say, people can be hurt worldwide.
Exactly. I'd like to add something to what you just read out there. What do those nations have in common? After those attacks that were based on government lies, they had considerable increases of cancer spikes due to the use of depleted uranium weapons. Now, depleted uranium can kill you just as surely as the asbestos can kill you. So they've been out spreading this stuff all over the place, but it's the justifications for the attack. When that's based on a lie, that's a war crime. That's an illegal war of aggression. And even in your country, Tony Blair, after 2003 Iraq, Chilcot report deemed him a war criminal, and they said he should be put before the ICC. They haven't done it yet. But I've always said after that Chilcot report came out, well, if Mr. Chilcot says Tony Blair was a war criminal, by inference, so is George W. Bush.
So there's no misunderstanding from our worldwide audience. We're talking about 9/11 here, and of course, we're talking about the US government and the US security services, but we have absolutely seen the same pattern of lies and involvement, complicity with UK and Western government and intelligence services. So this is not something which is simply a problem of the US, because it's a problem that's also existed in this country, for instance. If we come on to some detail, Karl, and I thought the best way of dealing with this was just to do a summary of the key events and chronology that you put together. So I've got a number of slides to take us through what I felt were key points to do with the World Trade Center, both before, during and after. Number one here, you're talking about 1987 for the first flagging up of the asbestos risk concerned with WTC. In 1987, the Port Authority put forward the lawsuit about their asbestos liability. Can you just explain that a little bit? I take it that they had discovered they've got buildings with asbestos in, and they were trying to offload the financial and insurance risk onto somebody else. Is that the way it was working?
Exactly, but it was also during the 80s when courts around the world were handing down colossal judgments against asbestos. Asbestos suppliers, asbestos mining companies, stuff like that. So the timing of their lawsuit was because law was changing. You had to get an environmental impact statement to even buy a building, finance a building, build a building. You had to make sure that the site was not a toxic waste dump. So the entire attitude towards environmental damages, environmental risk was changing at the same time they filed that lawsuit, all during the mid-'80s.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. Now, number three, 1992. This is where we've got asbestos running, but now we've got something else happening. Geopolitical, but also large-scale oil and gas exploration. In 1992, gas exploration rights were awarded to the Argentinian firm Bridas in eastern Turkmenistan. This is the starting point for some really incredible politics and actions by the US government. So put that 1992 gas exploration into context.
Well, immediately, you already had Unocal, and you had the Zalmay Khalilzad, who was they described him as the butcher of Bosnia. He was busy in Bosnia, but he was also busy over here lobbying for Unocal. But another company popped up. It's called Delta Oil. When we dug into who that is, that whole Delta Oil group is co-owned. There's two men that own it, but one of the co-owners is Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law. And they're over there trying to get control of the Caspian Basin pipeline and as many oil and gas leases as they can get. So like I said, the same names keep popping up over and over again. Then when the interference had reached the point to where Bridas was being harmed, that's when they filed the lawsuit in Fort Bend, Texas. It was Bridas versus Unocal and Delta Oil et al. And that goes back to Sandy Berger. Khalilzad was doing whatever Clinton told him to do, all during the 90s. So, he was over there lobbying for Unocal, which was a big Clinton backer.
We've got some more key events in the chronology. So 1993, you've covered that. We had the North Tower bombing, and of course, FBI implicated in that. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, the FBI were working with people from overseas, in particular the Middle East. So the terrorists who were planning that bomb attack had come from Middle East countries.
Yes, but they were actually in the United States. Whether it was legal or illegal, I don't know. But these Islamic people who were considered to be fairly radical, they were in the U.S. and the FBI was aiding and abetting them to try to blow up World Trade Center 1.
If we look at the chronology again, 1995, and this is what you'd mentioned a few moments ago, Bridas and Delta Oil get involved in a lawsuit, the value of which was $15 billion US. So this is not some idle squabble. This is absolutely a major battle between these two. And if I say what my understanding is, and you correct me, Bridas had spent a lot of time working with local countries on the ground in order to be able to explore for and extract oil and gas. And having done all of that preparatory work, American companies, of which Delta Oil was one, came in with the support of the US government to effectively take that exploratory work away and to pull the ground out from under them.
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. First, the lawsuit was filed in Texas. It was dismissed. They filed an appeal. It was dismissed. Then they came back as what's called an International Chamber of Commerce, as I say, the other ICC. They got an ICC arbitration award of $495 million. The defendants went running to the U.S. District Court in Houston twice, trying to vacate it, and 2 times at the U.S. Fifth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, the ICC award was upheld. But it took them until 2006 to get that $495 million. And Brian, that was basically reimbursement of costs that they had already incurred to get Turkmenistan, get those 2 oil and gas plants developed, get Afghanistan and the Taliban to sign a contract with them, and also in Pakistan. They had the whole deal sewed up until the interference started.
This is a key point, that the Argentinian company Bridas had worked completely lawfully in a commercial sense to engage with overseas countries in order to be able to explore, search for oil and gas, and ultimately extract it. And here we can see in the chronology that in 1996, Bridas had actually signed an agreement with the Taliban and General Rashid Dostum for that trans-Afghanistan pipeline. This, I think, will be of a huge surprise to many people, that anybody would be working with the Taliban, because, of course, we've been told time and time again that the Taliban are simply international terrorists. And yet here in 1996, Bridas is demonstrating that the Taliban were effectively working in a political sense in connection with new exploration projects and extraction of oil and gas. Just tell us a little bit about the importance of Afghanistan in the pipeline project that the Argentinian company was trying to get into place.
Due to terrain, you can't go further to the east and come through Pakistan. You have to go through Afghanistan. There's a series of valleys through there. They're negotiable. Until the United States changes their policies towards Iran, they're not going to be allowed to come due south across Iran. And Bridas was also building pipelines across Iran. They got along with them fine. But Afghanistan that was the keystone. They had the absolute perfect position to get that from Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, through Afghanistan, through a part of Pakistan to a place called Gwadar, Pakistan. That is a port city. And then this is just an aside. I found out about 2004 that George Bush, Tony Blair knew that they had been checkmated in 2002 when China and Pakistan signed the Belt and Road deal called CPEC, which is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. They took the port away from them. They didn't have any place to go. And I've been asking Americans, I said, when you start looking at all these details, why did they stay for 20 more years when they knew they'd been blocked?
Okay, 1997, it's hotting up. It's getting really serious because we've got Unocal and Delta Oil and the US government. So the US government backing, perhaps not surprisingly, the US companies, but they are doing everything they can to undermine that Taliban and Bridas deal. What sort of things did the US government and those companies get up to try and destabilize the deal?
Well, first, like I said, they had Zalmay Khalilzad over there during the Clinton administration lobbying for Unocal. Within Afghanistan itself, there was a lot of pressures put on them, to opt out and, oh, don't go with the Argentine company, go with us. And Bush was pushing that as late as August 2001. He was still threatening them. You'll either hand it over to us or we're coming after you. So, yeah, I mean, all those little bits and pieces, they were after the pipeline. Now, let me say this about 9/11. This is a piece of that story that most people don't know. Who set up the meeting with Larry Silverstein was actually the New York branch office, field office of the Secret Service. They set the meeting up with bomb experts, supposedly to defend his building from terror attack and bombing, but his building came down that same day in a controlled demolition. So it was already wired to come down. But then after 9/11, the Secret Service and the bomb experts stayed there for 3 more days looking for undetonated bombs in the World Trade Center towers because Bush was coming to town to point the finger of blame at Afghanistan. You follow me?
I absolutely follow you. And hold that analysis there. Let's just get back into the chronology, which is going to take us back to 9/11, of course, because we got the turbulence in 1997. It's getting really dirty and nasty as the US tries to undermine the Taliban and the brightest deal. And then in 1998, you point out that that's when Clinton attacks Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is not doing what the Americans want, it seems to me. And the result is that the Clinton administration ups the ante and says, we're going to show you that we mean business. So an excuse is made for an attack on Afghanistan. This is bully boy tactics, really.
Yeah, it's well, what they used to call it gunboat diplomacy. Yeah. Just pull up off your shore and start shelling you. Gunboat diplomacy. That's basically what Clinton was doing. Bush was after the same thing, and it's an endless cycle. And it's also it's like I said earlier, these are illegal wars. They're creating these wars based on lies. There was no threat. They're just going to try to take over resources and muscle people out of the way.
We've got January 2001, George W. Bush and Richard B. Cheney sworn in. And then I thought this was very significant piece of information from you, Karl. We had spring 2001, the US Army 10th Mountain Division prepares for invasion Afghanistan. How did you discover this information?
2 ways. I had friends in the Pentagon that told me what was going on. And I also know some people personally that their sons had been called up for duty for that purpose. When they came home for like Christmas or Thanksgiving, they were telling their families what it is they were getting ready to do.
Now, I really paused and read and reread when I came across this little statement in the information that you sent through, and that was that in spring, CENTCOM General, the US General Tommy Franks, he actually made a slip. He was asked a question in front of cameras, and he stated that the US primary mission in Afghanistan was, quote, the pipeline and access to the region's resources. How did you spot that very significant slip?
I was still collaborating with 9/11 Truth, and there were some people, it's boring to me. I hate to watch this C-SPAN, but there were people that would keep it turned on all the time. If anything looked like it might have something to do with 9/11, might have something to do with Afghanistan, terrorism, stuff like that. They actually got a copy of that and sent it to me. And when I was robbed in Berlin on December 2nd, 2011, that video that I had, what actually hit World Trade Center South Tower, and that video with Franks were taken. Luckily, I still have the still photos.
We've got the US military on the move. The clear target is Afghanistan. But let's just look at what else was happening around that Asbestos lawsuit. And thank you very much for pointing this out to us, Karl. So we got May 2001. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey lose the asbestos lawsuit. That's in the US District Court, Newark. And July 2001, lucky Larry Silverstein and the Australian real estate developer Frank Lowy sign a 99-year lease on the asbestos-plagued World Trade Center. This is all pretty incredible when you see all of these events and the detail maneuvering around the World Trade Center. We've got oil pipelines worth trillions ultimately in oil and gas deals. We've got problems with the buildings themselves in relation to asbestos. We've got failings of the US security services with regard to earlier terrorist threats, 1993 in this case. And then it's all becoming a bit convenient that there's actually the massive attack on the World Trade Center on 9/11.
Let me say this. There was something else going on against the Taliban, and this was during 2001. Delta Oil, the Saudi group that was involved in the lawsuit, teamed up with Unocal. They were offering the Taliban like $100 million a year. Just please sign the contract with us and get the hell out of our way. And the Taliban said, no, we've already made a commitment to this company. So that was going on all during, and Bush kind of upped the ante like in August 2001, where is that you're either going to do the deal with us or, we're coming after you. The threatening military intervention. And then the other thing that make sure we don't miss on this, 2 days before September 11th, the most powerful warlord and the most feared warlord in Afghanistan was assassinated. He had already told Bush he wasn't welcome to step foot in Afghanistan. And then the very next day, on the 10th, was when James Dorian in the Oil and Gas Journal was talking about what a motherlode of oil and gas this is, over in the Caspian Basin.
I have a little bit of detail here to do with the major players around these oil and gas details. Now, these are obviously slides that you've kindly sent through to us, but you've labelled them with respect to the individual countries involved. So in this case, it's Kazakhstan players, and then you've got including bribes. So some really dirty stuff was going on. Can you give us a little bit of explanation about some of these companies? Because there's so many of them. We've got Amoco, we've got Amerada Hess, we've got Chevron, ExxonMobil, Mayer Brown, Rowe, and more. From the US side, not as simple as just one or two companies involved.
Even GE was involved. They were over there wanting to sell these people natural gas electric generators, because they have all this natural gas. It was just the way I kind of look, it almost was like a shark feeding frenzy. As soon as the USSR went away, these people went rushing over there to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, to make sure that they had their foot in the door and, here's the wealthy USA, we'll make this happen for you. But at every turn, they kept leaving out a key thing. You got to have a pipeline to get it to an ocean. Period. End of statement.
And the key difficulty for America was they didn't have friendships with the countries they needed to have in order to be able to use their sovereign territory to run the US pipelines.
Exactly. I mean, after the Soviet-Afghan War, 1980, 1988, the United States was not welcomed over there anymore. They just kind of assumed that they were, but they weren't. And the Taliban have been very hard line against the U.S. They don't like how the U.S. does things.
Well, just pop the Kazakhstan one back, because the thing that you'd pointed out to people is how dirty it was. So in the right-hand column, maybe a little bit small, so I'll just focus people in on this. You've got BP Amoco, Baker and Botts, 2003-4, Amoco implicated in bribery scandal. Phillips Petroleum, 2003, implicated in bribery scandal. Chevron Texaco, 2004, implicated in bribery scandal. So, as you say, this was very dirty stuff going on here. And if it was commercial activity, it was unlawful, even in terms of what they could get away with at the time. And the next block that you put up were the major Uzbekistan players. And we've got Mayor Brown here at the top, including a joint office with Enron. And in 2002, Enron exec has pled guilty to California charges, El Paso to charges against Dinergy trading pending. Can you tell us a little bit more about these companies, or was it just more of the same, more dirty commercial deals in Uzbekistan?
What those energy companies were doing, they were fleecing the state of California by price fixing on the rates that they were selling them power. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, the ones that were least fined, not the heaviest fine, the least fined, all of a sudden they're over there and they're buying up energy generation plants in Pakistan. These are U.S. companies. You know, they don't have plants in Mexico or say Brazil, but all of a sudden they're involved all the way over in Pakistan. A lot of this stuff is like a flashing red light. You know, keep watching what these people are really up to.
In the table on Uzbekistan at the bottom, you've got reference to a book, Sheraton 2, Israeli Foreign Trade Risk Insurance Group. And then your comment is that it involves US and Israeli interests in Islamic Nation and an almost immediate surge in terrorism or outrage. What are you describing there?
When it got out that the Israeli that finance corporation was involved in that Sheraton 2 project, the Muslim people, because Israel hates Muslims, they pitched a fit. They had all kinds of problems. There was big riots, damage. You know, that was one of those things where I'd already learned to pay attention to the news going on in other countries, especially in that particular area. You know, what's going on in that particular area, because I knew what Bush was after.
In Turkmenistan, we've got really, it's the same sort of thing going on, but slightly different, but generally the same. Chevron Texaco, 2004, Condoleezza Rice has a super tanker named for her or after her. She was obviously in a pretty influential place then.
Well, she was in the first Bush administration. She was National Security Advisor. She was Secretary of State, second administration.
We've got BP Amoco, 2004, involved in the California energy pricing scam, but they got away with a light fine. And then you've got Unocal, Delta Petroleum and their Saudi partners. They are working together and obviously still trying to get hold of that Trans-Afghan pipeline. We've got Mayor Brown and Platt, 2003. The Turkmen government signed up with Bridas, but then renegade on that as a result of the influence by these other companies. So it does seem in the timeline that you've put together here that these US companies were slowly but surely starting to undermine the work of Bridas in the beginning.
Yeah, they still had to have that pipeline headed south. And, here we are over 24 years later, they still don't have a pipeline across there. But it was announced that Turkmenistan, instead of being the TAP pipeline, Trans-Afghanistan pipeline, the TAP, now it's TAPI, T-A-P-I. That's Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. They have joined forces to get that pipeline done.
Okay.
U.S. is not invited.
Right.
U.S. is not invited.
And Pakistan, it seems, is being used as a facilitating company to help on the US side. Is that right?
They tried it. I know during the Clinton administration, the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, he was urging Prime Minister Bhutto to go with Unocal, and she was offended because they had already signed the deal with Brdas. He was over, slumming around with her, trying to get her to back Unocal too.
And we've got a couple of maps here just to set the scene, and these are to deal with the Russian border states, I will call them. It's got Georgia and Azerbaijan, and basically you've said that the wars that took place in these areas were also predicated on the back of George Bush's Plan B pipeline.
Yep, he had been completely blocked from coming through Afghanistan and Pakistan. Things were a quagmire up in Turkmenistan because China had stepped in and was partnered with Brdas, CNOOC, the CNOOC. They were going to build the longest pipeline, I think, in the world, all the way to China from Bradas's oil leases over there. So Bush had to find another way to get out, and they attacked South Ossetia. I know the whole story of the war games they had in July 2008. And then on August the 8th, they attacked these people right after midnight, killed over 2,200 Russian passport holders because South Ossetia is only like 20 kilometers away from the pipeline right away Bush wanted. He was hoping he could take over there's a tunnel from South Ossetia to North Ossetia, which is inside Russian Federation, and use the Caucasus Mountains as a means for Russia not being able to bring armor to do anything about it.
This one here is what are called the White Stream route options, and the comment here is that the White Stream pipeline was promoted by George Soros and also envisaged Georgia being involved as part of the planned route to Crimea or Romania.
Yes, Soros was over there just waiting for Bush to finally get something done, mission accomplished, so he could do that pipeline there. And you can see by the little graph where it's going.
Okay. Now, Karl, I'm going to say that this probably brings us to a natural break point. And I'm going to say to the audience, we say this is the end of part one. And we'll open up with part two, having a look at more detail really around the 9/11 events themselves and what some of the implications are. So we'll say to you, thank you very much for joining the UK column for part one. And I'm sure our viewers and listeners will be really enthusiastic about you coming back with us to do part two, Karl, because there is so much to talk about. But for me, you have really opened my mind up to these events swirling around 9/11, which start to explain how these incredible events in New York took place and what was really driving them.
You probably know this since you have a military background, British Navy. Chaos is intentional. People create chaos so they can get things done without other people really realizing what they're really after. And just because I wrote that book, when I got over to Europe, U.S. actions directed against me have already screwed me out of $2.3 billion in project financing that I arranged for my company. The United States started stomping on everybody in sight. And, we would have been launched years ago. And we would have already turned tens of billions in revenues and profits, but for the United States. This has been a very personal battle between the Bush family and me. And then when the Clintons got in power, I'm no ally of the Clintons. I'm also not an ally of Barack Obama. So it's just been a long road for me. But we have the facts, and we're trying to find some way to get this thing brought into the courts, where we can nail these people to the wall with the truth.
Karl, thank you very much. I'm going to say thank you very much for joining me for this part one.
Thank you, Brian.